In a few seconds, you will hear the rain sound. I know you're still awake, staring out into the dark, trying to quiet a mind that just won't shut down. Just listen to my voice and let the road carry you tonight. Whenever I am driving alone in the dead of night looking past the dash cam at the endless highway, I can feel a cold, heavy weight around me. Right here, inside the cabin, I just passed a mangled, cracked guardrail on the shoulder. The metal twisted from an accident years ago, and I could swear a soul was standing right beside it, watching my headlights. The spirits of these forgotten roads crowd around my car, trying to tell me something, giving me goosebumps. But you are safe here in the passenger seat. As I am hearing this rain while driving, no worries. When the story starts, it will all calm down naturally and make the atmosphere soothing so you can relax for the rest of the night. The modern world runs on a rapid-fire rhythm of notifications and stress, keeping our nervous systems hyper-alert. But when time stresses, stories heal. I'm Deb, and this is True Horror Stories Film. Before we dive deeper into the dark, take a moment to subscribe and hit that like button. It helps keep our midnight sanctuary alive. If you feel like sharing, leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight. I have gathered these roadside secrets, and now I will share all these with you. Let us begin. My sister called me from that house 7 times in the last 2 weeks she was alive. 4 of those calls, she did not say anything about what was happening inside it. She talked about the weather, and her neighbor's dog, and whether I thought she should repaint the kitchen. And I said what I always said, and the call ended, and I went back to whatever I was doing. 3 of those calls, she did say something about it. I did not understand what she was telling me until she was gone, and understanding it afterward is the particular kind of late that does not get better with time. My sister Shelby was 29 years old when she moved to Hackensack, and she was the kind of person who moved to a small town in northern Minnesota in February because she had decided she wanted a different kind of life, and she was not the sort of person who decided things and then waited around for the conditions to be ideal. She was a graphic designer, and she worked remotely, and she had been living in Minneapolis for 4 years, and had arrived by the previous autumn at the conclusion that the city was costing her something she was not getting back, in the specific way that cities cost people who grew up in small places and who return to the noise and the proximity of other people's lives and find after a while that the returning has an interest rate they did not know they were paying. She found the house online. It was a rental owned by a man in Brainerd who had inherited it from his parents and who did not want to manage it from a distance, but also was not ready to sell it. And the rent was low for the size of the place, which was a 3-bedroom house on 2 acres with the Chippewa National Forest beginning at the back property line. She sent me photos the day she moved in. The kitchen with its yellow walls, the front porch with the railing that needed painting, the backyard and the tree line, the birches at the forest's edge going white in the February light. She looked happy in the photos she was in. Genuinely, Specifically happy, the kind of happy that belongs to a person who has made a decision that fits them and knows it. For the first 5 months, she was happy. I know this because I know Shelby, or I knew her, and I know the difference between the voice she used when she was performing fine and the voice she used when she actually was. And from February through June, she called me twice a week, and she actually was. The first call that was different came in July. She did not lead with what was different. We talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things before she said, in the middle of a sentence about something else, that the house had been making a sound she could not locate. I asked her what kind of sound. She thought about it for a moment, and then she said it was like breathing. But she immediately walked that back, said that was not quite right, said it was more like the sound a house makes when the pressure changes, when the weather is shifting, the sound of the structure adjusting to something. But the weather had not been shifting, she said. It had been dry and still for a week. She said she had checked everything she could think to check. The vents, the water heater, the refrigerator, the pipes, under the bathroom sink. Nothing was producing the sound she was hearing. It came from no particular room, and from no particular direction within the rooms it was in, which was most of them, at various hours, more often at night than during the day. I said old houses do that. She said she knew, and that was probably what it was. She changed the subject. I let her. The second call that was different came 3 weeks later, in early August. She told me about the smell. She described it the way she described everything, which was precisely because Shelby was a precise person and applied the same attention to language that she applied to the visual things she worked with. She said it was a cold smell. She said that was not a temperature. She knew the smell could not have a temperature. But that cold was the word that kept arriving when she tried to find the right one. Something underneath the ordinary house smells, she said. Underneath the coffee and the wood and the cleaning things she used. Something that did not belong to anything in the house or near it. Something older than the house, was what she said. And then she laughed slightly and said she knew how that sounded. I said it sounded like a house in the North Woods. And she said maybe. And she said probably. And then she said she was not sleeping as well as she had been, and changed the subject. And I let her do that too. The third call that was different came on a Thursday evening in the second week of October, and it was different from the first two in a way that I understood even then was not a small difference. She called at 7 in the evening, which was unusual for a Thursday, and she talked for the first few minutes in the ordinary way. But the ordinary way was being maintained with an effort that I could hear underneath it. The slight over-precision of a person who is holding something at bay while they talk around it. I asked her how the house was. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told me about the corner of the living room. The living room in the Hackensack house had 4 corners, and 3 of them were what corners are, and the 4th was in the northwest. behind the reading chair that had come with the furnished rental, and Shelby said that for the past several days she had found it difficult to look directly at that corner. She said this carefully, the way she said things when she knew they sounded strange, and she was not interested in softening them. She said it was not that there was anything in the corner. She said the corner was a corner, and that she had stood in it and looked at it in full daylight, and it was walls and baseboard and a section of the original wallpaper that the landlord had not replaced, a faded yellow pattern that had been in there since the 1970s. But at night, she said, with the lamps on in the room otherwise familiar and ordinary, the northwest corner was different in a way she could not describe as anything other than wrong. The geometry of it was wrong. That was the closest she could get, she said. The shape of the shadow in it did not match the shape of the corner, not dramatically. Not in a way that a photograph would have shown, just enough that the eye noticed, and then the eye did not want to look anymore. And after a few days of the eye not wanting to look, she had begun to find herself arranging herself in the room to face away from it. She said she was telling me because she thought that saying it out loud to someone might make it easier to stop thinking about it. I asked if she wanted to come to Minneapolis for the weekend. She said she had a deadline, and that she was fine, and that she was probably just spending too much time alone in a house in the woods, and her brain was making things to pay attention to. I said that was probably right. I believed it when I said it, and I have spent 19 months understanding the specific weight of that. She called me 2 more times before she died. Both times the calls were ordinary. Both times she was the version of herself that I had heard from February through June, the happy version. The one that had made a decision that fit her. I have thought about those 2 calls more than I have thought about the 3 difficult ones, because those last 2 calls were either Shelby genuinely better, or Shelby choosing not to tell me something, and I do not know which it was, and I will not know, and the not knowing is its own particular shape of grief. She died on a Sunday morning in late October. The official cause was cardiac, which her doctor said could happen in young, healthy people, and which I have been told by everyone who is supposed to know these things is an adequate explanation, and which I have been able to accept on some days and not on others. She was found by her neighbor, a woman named Iris, who lived a mile up the road, and who had been in the habit of checking on Shelby when she did not see her car move for 2 days. Iris had a key given to her early in the rental for exactly that kind of purpose, and she let herself in and found Shelby in the living room in the reading chair, the one that faced away from the northwest corner. She was facing away from the corner. I drove to Hackensack the following Thursday to handle the house, to take Shelby's things and return the keys to the landlord, and do the accounting of what a young woman's life amounts to when it has to put in boxes and carried out of the rooms it happened in. I brought my husband Glenn because I could not have done it alone, and because Glenn is the kind of person who understands when a thing needs to be done and does it without making the doing of it about himself. We arrived in the evening. I had planned to come in the morning, but the drive from Minneapolis took longer than it should have. A slow-moving accident on the interstate that added 2 hours, and by the time we turned onto the gravel road off County 3, the sky was the last kind of dark before full dark. The deep blue that stays for 20 minutes in October in Minnesota before it becomes black. The house was lit by the motion sensor light above the front door, which Iris had told me would come on when we pulled in. I sat in the car for a minute. Glenn did not say anything, which was the right thing. He has a gift for understanding when the right thing is silence. I went inside. The smell hit me before I reached the light switch. I want to be precise about this because Shelby had described it precisely, and I had not understood her description until the moment I was inside it. She had said cold. She had said it was not a temperature. She had said something older than the house. All of that was accurate. She had been precise, and I had not understood the precision, because precision about smell is a thing that does not fully transmit in language that requires the experience to land correctly. What I understood, standing in Shelby's entryway with Glenn behind me and the dark of the gravel road behind him, was that the smell was not a smell. It was an absence of the smells that should have been there, and in the place of those smells was something that had no business being in a house in northern Minnesota in October, something that was not pine or lake water or cold air or wood or any of the things the house had been built into. Something that had been there long enough to replace the other things. I found the light switch. We spent the evening working, because working was what there was. Glenn boxed the kitchen while I went through the bedroom, and I moved methodically the way you move when the alternative is stopping, taking Shelby's things off the surfaces and out of the drawers, and building a careful physical record of what she had accumulated in 8 months of a life she had chosen on purpose. Her sketchbooks were on the desk in the second bedroom that she had used as a studio. I set them aside. There were 7 of them, and I did not open them that night, because some things require a certain kind of readiness that I was not going to have in that house. I opened them later, at home in Minneapolis, and I will get to that. I avoided the living room for most of the evening. I told myself this was because it was the last room, the natural end of the process. The one you saved because it required a different kind of attention than the others. When I finally went in, Glenn was with me, and we stood in the doorway for a moment. The room was ordinary, the furniture that had come with the rental, the lamps on the end tables, the rug that Shelby had bought at a shop in Brainerd, and that was the only thing in the room that was definitively hers. The reading chair, facing away from the northwest corner. I looked at the northwest corner. I am going to tell you what I saw in it, and I am going to be as accurate as I can. I saw a corner, walls and baseboard, and the original wallpaper in the faded yellow pattern that had been there since the 1970s. The overhead light was on, a single fixture in the center of the ceiling, and it threw shadows into the corners in the way that a centered light throws shadows, equal and predictable and architectural. 3 of the corners were what corners are. The northwest corner was wrong. I do not mean it wrong the way Shelby had said it, with the careful qualifications of a person trying to be precise. I mean wrong in the direct and physical way, the way a sound is wrong when it is the wrong note. The way a face is wrong when something about the proportions has shifted by a small and uncorrectable amount. The shadow in the northwest corner was not the shadow that the corner should have had. Given the position of the light and the geometry of the walls, it was taller than the corner, by perhaps a foot, by the amount that something standing in a corner and pressed back into the angle of it would extend above the geometry of the walls if it were taller than the room expected. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at Glenn. Glenn was looking at the corner. His jaw was set in the way it sets when he is doing something that requires more from him than he is going to acknowledge out loud. I said his name. He looked at me. I said, "Do you see that?" He said, "Yes." That one word, from a man who does not say things he does not mean, is something I have carried for 19 months. We did not stay in the living room. We finished what we needed to finish, and we turned out the lights, and we locked the house, and we drove to the motel in Hackensack rather than staying in the house as I had planned, and in the morning we went back and loaded the car, and I dropped the keys at the landlord's contact address, and we drove back to Minneapolis. On the way home, I told Glenn about the 3 calls, about the sound and the smell and the corner. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the reasons I married him. When I finished, he said, "I think she was trying to tell you." I said, "I know." He said, "I think she did not want to worry you." I said, "I know." That is a conversation I also carry. At home, when I was ready, I opened the sketchbooks. 6 of them were what you would expect from Shelby's sketchbooks: design work, color studies, page after page of the precise visual thinking that had made her good at what she did. With handwritten notes in the margins, in her small, careful printing, the notation system she had developed over years of working the way she worked. The 7th sketchbook was different. It was the most recent one, started sometime in September, based on the date she had written on the inside cover, the way she always dated them. The first 30 or so pages were the same as the others. Work studies, margin notes, and then, somewhere around the middle of the book, the work stopped. What came after was drawings of the house, not architectural drawings, not the kind of carefully measured rendering she could have done easily. These were the drawings of someone working quickly, working at night, working with the specific urgency of a person who is trying to get something out of their head and onto paper before they lose the shape of it. Room after room, the kitchen, the hallway, the bedroom, each one drawn from slightly different angles, from the perspective of someone in a chair or lying in a bed or standing in a doorway. And in every drawing, in the corner that would have been the northwest corner of the living room from whatever angle she was drawing, there was something she had drawn in pencil, and then gone over in pen, and then gone over in pencil again, as if no single medium was capturing it correctly. It was not detailed, It did not have a face or a form in any complete sense. It was a tall thing, at the edge of the light, in the corner. Patient. I have the sketchbook. I am not going to show it to anyone, not because I am protective of it exactly, but because I do not know what showing it would accomplish. And because some things exist to be carried by the person who found them rather than distributed, and because Shelby drew it for herself, to get it out of her head, not for an audience. What I have done instead is try to find a framework for it, to understand what was in that house, what she shared those 8 months with, what was standing in the northwest corner, in the increasing frequency of her drawings, as the sketchbook moved toward October. I spoke to Iris, the neighbor, over the phone in the months after. She had lived on that road for 19 years, and she had known the family that owned the house before the landlord's parents bought it. And she knew the road in the way that people know roads they have lived on for a long time, which is to say, in the body rather than the head. I asked her, carefully, whether she had ever heard anything about the house. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that the house had a history of short tenancies, that in the 20 years she had been on that road, she could count 8 or 9 different people who had rented it and left within a year, and she had always attributed this to the isolation, which was real, and the winters, which were serious, and the distance from anything that people who were not from the Northwoods expected to be near. I asked her if any of them had said anything about the house itself. She said one had. A woman, 3 renters before Shelby, who had stayed 5 months and then left in December without giving the landlord proper notice, which had apparently been a dispute that took some resolving. Iris had spoken to her once, briefly, before she left, and the woman had said that the house did not feel empty when it should have. She said it the way Iris told it to me, matter-of-factly, without elaboration, not as a complaint, but as a statement of fact, the way you state a fact about a place that you are leaving, and will not have to think about again. The house did not feel empty when it should have. I think about Shelby in that house for 8 months, watching the corner, hearing the sound, smelling the smell, and calling me and not quite saying it, not wanting to worry me, changing the subject, and then in the last 2 calls being the happy version again, the one that made a decision that fit her. I do not know what that shift was. I hope it was peace. I hope she found something in those last 2 weeks that let her sit in the reading chair facing away from the corner without fear, that let her make ordinary calls about ordinary things and mean them. I hope that. But I also know Shelby, and I know that she was above everything else, a person who faced the things she was dealing with and drew them until she had them on paper, until the shape of them was outside her head and in a place she could look at it. The last drawing in the 7th sketchbook is different from the others. The house is not in it, the corner is not in it. It is just the tall thing, drawn on a full page, taking up the whole page, drawn and redrawn and gone over until the pencil ends and the pen had both worked the paper thin. And underneath it, in her small, careful printing, she had written 4 words. It knows I see it. I have not gone back to Hackensack. The house has a new tenant. I am told. A young man from Duluth who teaches remotely and wanted somewhere quiet. I have thought about calling him. I have not called him. I do not know what I would say, and I do not know what saying it would change. And I think about what Shelby would have wanted me to do, and I cannot find a clear answer in anything she left behind. What I can tell you is this. She was not being dramatic. She was not alone in what she experienced, because a woman 3 tenants before her felt it too, and a man who built a life out of noticing things and not talking about them would know the shape of it if I could ask him. She drew it 19 times in the last 6 weeks of her life. She sat in a chair facing away from it, and in the end she wrote 4 words underneath the last drawing of it in her small and careful and precise hand. It knows I see it. I think about those 4 words most in the early morning, in the specific quiet before the city comes back to itself, when the apartment is as close to the quality of a house at the end of a gravel road off County 3 as it is ever going to get. I think about Shelby in the reading chair. I think about the corner she was facing away from. And I think about what it means that she wrote those 4 words, and whether knowing it sees you back is a comfort or the opposite of one. And I have been thinking about that for 19 months, and I am no closer to an answer. Some questions are not built to have one. I did not hear it come in. That is the part I keep returning to, even now. Even sitting in a room with every light burning and the television on in the next room, it's just to put a voice in the air. I did not hear a single thing until the moment it was already there, and by then, the choice had already been made for me. There are sounds I will never be able to explain, and there are 4 minutes of a night in October I will never be able to account for, and I have stopped trying to do either. There is a particular quality to the quiet in Warren County, Pennsylvania, in the 2nd week of October, after the hunting season has opened, but before the serious cold sets in, when the tourists who come for the fall color have gone home and the roads belong again to the people who live on them and the things that have always moved through the forest without caring whether anyone was watching. I know that quiet well. I grew up inside it. What I am going to tell you happened 13 months ago, on a Thursday night on the gravel road that runs between my cousin Dale's property and the old Kinzua Reservoir access, a stretch of maybe 4.5 miles that I have driven since I was old enough to sit behind a wheel without a licensed adult in the car, which in that part of Pennsylvania and at that particular period of my youth was younger than it legally should have been. I am going to be precise. I have been composing this for 13 months, and precision is the only thing I have left to offer it. I was 36 years old, and I had been staying at Dale's for 3 days, helping him clear the back section of his property after 2 white pines came down in a September windstorm and landed across the fence line he shared with the state forest boundary.
Dale is 51, and he has a bad hip, and the work was slow.
We spent the days cutting and hauling and stacking, and the evenings the way evenings go in that house, on the back porch with something warm in a mug, and the sound of the creek below the tree line. Talking about the things that men who grew up together in the same county talk about when they are tired and comfortable and not trying to impress anyone. On the Thursday night, Dale's wife called from her sister's place in Erie to say that her sister had taken a fall and she was going to stay an extra 2 days. And Dale said he was going to drive up Friday morning rather than leave her to manage alone, and that was that. We ate dinner, we cleared the table, and sometime around 9:30, Dale went to bed because he was going to be up before 5 to make the drive. I should have slept too. I am the kind of person who does not sleep well in other people's houses. Not because of anything wrong with the houses. Because of something wrong with me. A restlessness that wakes me at 2 in the morning, regardless of where I am or how tired I was when I close my eyes. And that sends me to the kitchen or the porch, or if I am in my own place, the car, for a drive around the block that sometimes becomes a drive around the county before I feel settled enough to go back. I know this about myself. It is not a recent discovery. What I should have done was lie down and accept the 2 or 3 hours I was going to get, and save the rest for the drive home in the morning. What I did instead, at 10:45 at night, was get in the truck and take the gravel road toward the reservoir access, because I had done it 100 times when I needed to clear my head, because the road is straight and the trees close it in, and at night, with the headlights cutting through the dark. It has a tunnel quality that I have always found easier to breathe inside than the wide-open feeling of the main roads. That is my vulnerability, not drama. Not grief, though there was some of that too. My mother had died in August, and I had not fully processed that yet. And being in Dale's house, which looked enough like my own childhood home that certain angles of it caught me off guard, was doing something to my chest that I had been trying not to examine too directly. That is the thing the darkness found. Not a wound exactly. A tender place. A place where I was not looking. The drizzle started about a mile in, not rain. Drizzle. The kind that is more mist than water, that does not make noise on the roof of the truck, but fogs the windshield slowly until the headlights begin to blur at the edges. I turned the defroster on and the wipers to their slowest setting, and the road ahead clarified in intervals. The trees coming clear and then going soft and then coming clear again with each slow pass of the blade. The first wrong thing was small enough that I recorded it and moved on. About a mile and a half in, where the road bends slightly right before it straightens again for the long run toward the reservoir. There is a section of fence on the left side, an old post and rail thing that marks the corner of a property that was sold and resold and eventually abandoned sometime in the 1980s and has been in county receivership ever since. The fence has been falling apart for the 20 years I have been driving past it, and a section of it had come down since I last came this way. 2 rails and a post lying in the mud at the roadside. That was not the wrong thing. The wrong thing was the smell. It entered through the defroster, which was pulling outside air. And I want to be honest about this, because the word wrong does not do it justice. It was the smell of something that has been very cold for a very long time. Not decay. Not the smell of the forest after rain, which is green and mineral and alive. Something underneath that. Something that the rain smell was sitting on top of, the way a rug sits on top of a floor. And when you notice the floor, you stand honest that it was there the whole time, and you wonder how you did not notice it before. I reached over and switched the defroster to recirculate. The smell stayed, not as strong, but present in the back of the cab, in the way that a smell stays when it has already established itself in a space, and recirculating the air only dilutes it without removing it. I kept driving. The wipers moved. The headlights reached about 30 feet into the drizzle, before the light scattered and became general, which meant the trees on both sides now were dark past a certain point. And the dark past that point was the kind of dark that does not graduate, does not lighten toward some middle distance. It simply stopped being visible all at once. Like a wall. I had driven half a mile further when I saw what was standing at the road's edge. Right side, maybe 20 feet past a section of culvert pipe that had been laid alongside the road for a drainage project that had been started 2 summers ago, and as of the last time I came this way in August, had not been completed. The pipe was still there, sections of it stacked beside a mound of displaced gravel, and 20 feet past the last section, in the mud and gravel at the absolute edge of where my headlights reached, something was standing. I had approximately 2 seconds of it in my lights before I was past it, tall. That is what registered. Not in any articulate way, not as a thought with words attached, but as a physical fact that arrived in my body before my brain had finished forming an opinion about what I was looking at. It was the wrong size for a deer. It was the wrong shape for anything I knew how to name that would be standing on the side of that road at 11 at night in October. Its arms were at its sides. I was past it. I looked in the mirror. The road behind me was empty. I drove for a quarter mile, and then I pulled the truck over. I sat with the engine running and both hands on the wheel, and I thought about it carefully. A person. That was the available explanation, and it was not an unreasonable one. People walked this road, hunters checking trail cameras, and people from the houses further up toward the reservoir, who used the road for exercise even in the dark. A person in dark clothing, standing at the shoulder, perhaps startled by the headlights and having stepped back into the shadow before I cleared the curve. Perfectly reasonable. I did not feel the way I feel when something is perfectly reasonable. My mouth was dry in the specific way it goes dry when the body has decided something before the mind has caught up to it. The hair on my arms was doing something I was trying to ignore, and the smell was still present, faint but there, in the cab of the truck with the defroster set to recirculate and the windows up. I made a choice that I have replayed many times in the 13 months since. I turned the truck around. Not immediately. I sat for maybe 2 minutes first, I told myself I was turning around because I wanted to make sure it was not someone who needed help. I told myself this sincerely, and part of me believed it. And another part of me understood that what I actually wanted was to see it again, to get a better look, to bring it from the edge of the headlights into the center of them, where I could see what it was clearly, and name it, and file it correctly, and drive the rest of the road without the feeling I was currently carrying in the center of my chest. I turned around. I drove back along the road I had come from slowly this time, the wipers going, the headlights cutting the drizzle. I passed the culvert pipe. I passed the drainage gravel. I passed the 20 feet of road beyond it. There was nothing there. I stopped the truck. I left it running. I put the window down and looked out at the shoulder in the rain-wet dark, at the mud and the edge of the tree line and the fence post of the old abandoned property visible at the far reach of the headlights. And there was no one there. No footprints visible in the mud from where I was sitting. No sound of movement in the trees. Nothing. I put the window up. I sat with that for longer than I should have, because sitting with it was preferable to the alternative, which was accepting that whatever I had seen had either not been there or was somewhere that the headlights were not reaching, and neither of those options was particularly comfortable. I started driving again, forward this time, back toward the reservoir and the original direction. The road straightens completely about a mile past the culvert section, and on a clear night, you can see the access lot lights at the reservoir from the straight section, a faint yellowish glow above the tree line about 2 miles ahead. Tonight the drizzle obscured them, but I knew they were there, and knowing was enough. I was on the straight section, a mile into it, when the cold came into the cab. Not from the vents. The vents were set to recirculate, pulling interior air, nothing from outside. The cold came from the air that was already in the cab, which went from the moderate temperature of a truck that has been running its heater for 40 minutes to something several degrees colder in the span of about 4 seconds, localized in the passenger seat and the rear seat behind it, the way cold is localized when something that is very cold sits down in a space that was warm. I did not look at the passenger seat. I want to be honest about that. I made a deliberate choice in that moment not to look. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands on the wheel, and I drove the straight section with the cold sitting in the seat beside me and the smell much stronger now, filling the cab the way a smell fills a closed space when its source is close, and I drove. My hands were shaking. The specific fine tremor of the hands when they are gripping something tightly, and the body is directing its resources elsewhere. I noticed this in a detached way. The way you notice physical facts when the mind is occupied with something it is not going to let you look at directly. I was thinking about my mother. I am going to tell you that plainly. In the worst moment of that drive, with the cold in the seat beside me and the smell in the cab, and my hand shaking on the wheel, what my mind landed on was my mother, the kitchen of her house. The specific smell of it, coffee and dish soap, and the lavender thing she kept on the windowsill. The way the linoleum creaked at the threshold between the kitchen and the hallway. The sound of her television through the wall when I was a child trying to sleep in the room next to hers. The ordinary accumulated sensory fact of a person who had existed for 68 years and then stopped. I thought about this with remarkable clarity and focus, the same way I thought about it in the weeks after August, when grief does that particular thing, where it presents itself as comfort and ambush at the same time. The mind will reach for what it loves when it is afraid of what it is carrying. I drove the straight section. I did not look at the passenger seat. The cold stayed where it was. And then I heard something from the back seat. Not a loud sound, not dramatic. The sound a person makes when they shift their weight slightly, when they adjust how they are sitting. A small, soft sound of movement against the upholstery, the specific creak and settle of the rear bench seat. The truck has a rear bench seat. It was empty when I left Dale's. I know this because I put my jacket on it before I got in the driver's seat, and I had seen it there. My jacket, alone on the seat, in the interior light before I closed the door. I looked in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. My jacket was there. The cold was still in the cab. The smell was still in the cab. And I understood with the same clarity that you understand things in the body before you are ready to understand them in the mind, that empty was not precisely the right word for what the back seat was. I did not stop the truck. I drove to the end of the road, to the reservoir access lot with its yellow security light above the gate, its gravel surface shining with the drizzle, its complete and absolute ordinariness. The gate, the sign, the concrete parking barrier, the light. I pulled into the lot and sat under the security light with the truck in park and the engine running and every interior light I could turn on turned on. And I sat there until my hands stopped shaking. It took a while. The cold left gradually, not all at once. It thinned, the way cold thins when the source of it has moved away rather than when the heater has warmed the air. A directional dissipation, starting at the front of the cab and retreating toward the back, and then gone. The smell went with it. I sat for maybe 20 minutes in that parking lot under that light. And then I drove back to Dale's on the main road, the long way around, adding 12 miles because I was not going back on the gravel road in the dark. And I did not explain this to myself with any particular story. I simply took the long way and arrived at Dale's at 1:10 in the morning and let myself in quietly and sat in the kitchen with the overhead light on for an hour before I felt like lying down. I did not sleep. Dale drove to Erie the next morning at 5, as planned. I left an hour after him, and I drove home to Pittsburgh on the interstate, and I did not take any back roads, and I did not stop until I was past the county line. What I have done in the 13 months since is try to find a shape for it that fits inside the categories I have available. The smell, the cold in the cab with the recirculated air and the windows up, the sound from the back seat, the figure at the road's edge that was there when I passed it and gone when I went back. I have spoken to 2 people about it. Old friends, people who grew up in Warren County, People who have driven that road themselves on winter nights and know the specific quality of the dark out there, the way the forest holds it differently than open country does. Neither of them offered me an explanation. That is what I remember most about those conversations. Usually when you tell someone something, they reach for an explanation. These two did not. They listened, and they were quiet for a moment, and one of them said, simply, that the old reservoir road had a history, and that she had always taken the main road after dark, and that she had not questioned that preference very deeply. I asked her what she meant by history. She said she was not sure exactly. Only that certain places in that part of the county had a quality that people in the area understood without discussing. The way you understand that a particular intersection has had too many accidents and you slow down there without being told to. Accumulated knowledge, the kind that lives in behavior rather than in words. I asked if she had ever seen anything on that road. She said she had seen something once, years ago, on the straight section. Something standing at the road's edge. That was taller than it should have been, and that had gone when she looked a second time. I asked what it looked like. She thought for a moment, and then she said, "It did not seem to have a face." I have thought about that for 13 months. Not the content of it, exactly. The way she said it. With the particular stillness of a person who has been holding something for a long time, and has found unexpectedly that someone else is holding the same thing. It did not seem to have a face. I check the back seat of my truck now before I get in. Every time, morning, afternoon, and evening well-lit parking lots in the middle of the day. I check it and I find it empty, as it should be, as it almost certainly always will be. But the almost is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. And sometimes in the early hours of the morning, in the apartment in Pittsburgh, where I have lived for 7 years, and where nothing has ever happened that I could not explain, I wake up to the smell of cold. Not the cold itself, the smell of it. Earth and iron and something older than either. And I do not get up. I do not turn on the light. I lie very still, the way I learned to be still on the road that night, and I wait for it to thin, and it does. And then I lie in the dark for the rest of the night, listening to nothing, and I am grateful for the nothing, and I do not look toward the foot of the bed. I have decided that is also the right choice. The last thing my father ever said to me, on the phone 3 hours before he died, was that something had been standing in the yard the night before, and that he had not wanted to say anything because he did not want me to worry, and that he was probably being foolish. He was not being foolish. I know that now, in the way that knowing things too late sits in you differently than not knowing them at all, heavier and more specific, and with a particular angle to it that ordinary grief does not have. My father was not a man who frightened easily, and I want to establish that first, not because it changes what happened, but because it changes the weight of the fact that he called me about it at all. He was 64 years old, and he had lived alone at the end of Reliance Road for 11 years, since my mother moved to Chattanooga after the divorce. And in those 11 years, he had dealt with a black bear going through his compost 3 years running, a wildfire that came within a quarter-mile of his property line in the summer of 2019. A water heater that failed in January and left him without hot water for 9 days while he waited for the part. And a copperhead he found under the back step in May that he relocated himself with a stick and a plastic tub, calmly, the way he did most things. He was not a man who called me to say he was worried about something in the yard. So when he did, 3 hours before the heart attack that killed him on a Tuesday morning in late September, I should have heard it differently than I heard it. I heard it as my father being slightly unlike himself, slightly more inclined to talk about things he would normally file away as nothing. I heard it as a tired man, alone in a mountain house in the fog, having a rare moment of letting something in that he would usually keep at the door. I did not hear it as the last thing he would ever tell me. I have been going back to that phone call for 9 months, the way you go back to something you cannot change but cannot leave alone. And what I hear in it now, in the specific way he said the words, probably being foolish, the pause before probably, and the slight roughness in his voice that I had catalogued as fatigue, is a man who knew on some level that what he had seen was not nothing, and who was giving me the information because he wanted someone else to have it, just in case. Just in case. I drove down from Knoxville 3 days after he died to close up the house, and I stayed longer than I planned to. The way you stay longer than you plan to when the alternative is leaving a place that still smells like someone you are not ready to stop being near. It is the smell that gets you first every time. Every person I have talked to who has gone through a parent's house after the loss says the same thing, and knowing it does not prepare you for it. You walk in, and the smell of them is there, undiminished, as if the house has not received the information yet. My father's house smelled like coffee and cedar, and the particular mineral smell of river air that comes off the Hiwassee and gets into everything within a mile of the bank. It smelled like his soap and his boots drying by the back door and the cedar chest in the bedroom where he kept the extra blankets. I stood in the entryway for a long time before I could do anything else. I spent the first 2 days on the practical work, because the practical work is what there is when grief has not yet decided what shape it is going to take. I sorted and boxed and stacked. I dealt with the utilities and the mail and the bank, the long procedural list of what it takes to close a life administratively, which is its own kind of loss. The way each account and subscription canceled is a small official confirmation of the thing you are already carrying. I slept in his house, in the room he had called the guest room, which was smaller than his own room and looked out over the backyard rather than the front, and which had been my room when I stayed during hunting season, which I had done every November for the 8 years since the divorce. The backyard was narrow, maybe 60 feet from the porch to the tree line, and the forest behind it was the Cherokee National Forest, which runs uninterrupted for hundreds of thousands of acres east and north from that property line. Standing at the back door, you could see the first row of trees in daylight, the big hemlocks and tulip poplars that marked the edge of his land, and beyond them, the forest went dark immediately and stayed dark, the kind of dark that deep forest in the southern Appalachians earns for itself. At night, with the fog off the river, you could see almost nothing past the porch light. The light reached about 30 feet, which was approximately halfway across the yard, and the second 30 feet was the fog and whatever was behind it. On my third night in the house, the night before I had planned to drive back to Knoxville, I could not sleep. This was not unusual. I had not slept well since the hospital, but this was a different quality of awake than the grief awake I had been living in, less internal, more directed outward, as if something outside the room was making a claim on my attention without specifying what it was. I lay in the guest room bed and I listened to the house. I know the sounds of that house the way I know the sounds of my own, which is to say well enough to notice when something is different. The creak of the third stair, the way the kitchen faucet drips once, slowly, after you turn it off. The sound the back porch makes when the temperature drops is a low settling complaint from the boards. At some time around 2 in the morning, I did not check the clock until afterward, but that is my estimate. I heard something I could not locate inside the house's usual catalog. It was a sound from outside, from the backyard, not loud, not dramatic. The sound of something that weighs enough to press the wet grass down when it moves. A soft and intermittent sound that was almost nothing and that I was aware of only because the rest of the night was so quiet that almost nothing was audible. I got up. I am telling you that plainly because I want to be honest about the sequence. I got up without significant deliberation, not because I was brave. Because my father had told me 3 days before he died that something had been standing in the yard, and I had been sleeping 20 feet from that yard for 2 nights, and some part of me had been waiting for this without knowing it. I went to the window. The backyard was in fog. The porch light was on. I had left it on every night, because the switch was in the kitchen, and I passed it going to bed, and it reached into the fog and illuminated approximately the first half of the yard in a way that was more general than focused, more glow than light, the fog taking the beam and spreading it until it was not a direction anymore but a quality of the air. At the edge of the light, at approximately the 30-foot mark, where the porch beam ran out and the fog took over, something was standing. I want to be careful here. I want to be accurate rather than dramatic, because accuracy is the only thing I have to offer this, and I have been working at it for 9 months. It was tall. That is the first thing, and it is the thing the body understands before the mind has organized an opinion, not as a judgment or a comparison, but as a physical fact that arrives in the chest before it arrives in the head. It was the wrong height for a deer, which I have seen in that yard 100 times. It was the wrong shape for any animal I knew how to name in that context. It was standing at the edge of the light with the fog around it, and it was facing the house. Its arms were at its sides. There is a particular stillness that living things do not have. Trees have it. Fence posts have it. A thing that has never been required to move has it. And a thing that is choosing not to move does not have it, not perfectly, because the choice of not moving is still a kind of motion, still visible in the small continuous adjustments that a body makes when it is holding itself in place. What was standing at the edge of my father's porch light had the stillness of the first kind, the stillness of something that was not restraining movement, but that simply had no movement to restrain. I stood at the window, and I looked at it. I looked at it for what I estimate was 4 or 5 minutes, which is a long time to look at something in a fog-lit yard at 2 in the morning. And in those 4 or 5 minutes it did not move. It did not shift. It did not make any of the small adjustments that living things in the cold make when they have been standing in one place for a while. The fog moved. Everything else was still. My hands, I noticed, were pressed flat against the window frame on both sides, bracing the way hands brace when the body wants to be ready for something without knowing what the something is. My mouth was dry. The back of my neck was doing something I can only describe as an awareness that did not belong to the cold. I thought about my father. I am going to tell you exactly what I thought about because it matters and because it is the truest thing in this account. I thought about the phone call, about the pause before probably, about the particular roughness in his voice. I thought about him standing at this same window, or at the kitchen window, which also faced the backyard, and seeing what I was seeing now, and deciding not to tell me until the morning, because he did not want me to worry, and calling me in the morning and telling me anyway, because he had decided I should know. He had seen this. Whatever this was, my father had stood in this house and looked at it, and he had been alone when he did, and he had carried it from the night he saw it to the morning he called me, which was 3 hours before he died, and he had not told anyone until that call, because he did not want to be the kind of man who told people about things standing in his yard at night. I cannot tell you what that felt like, standing at the window, understanding that. I can tell you that it did something to the fear, not replaced it, sat beside it, made it possible to keep looking. After perhaps 5 minutes, I moved away from the window, not running, not quickly. I stepped back into the room, and I stood in the center of it, and I breathed, and I thought about what to do, and what I decided to do was go to the kitchen. I went to the kitchen. I turned on the overhead light, the bright one, the one my father always complained was too harsh for the evening, but used in the morning when he was making coffee before the sun came up. I filled the kettle and put it on, and I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. From the kitchen window, the angle was different, but the porch light was still on, and the yard was still visible in the same foggy general way. The edge of the light was empty. I stood at the kitchen window with the kettle beginning to heat behind me, and I looked at the empty yard for a long time. The fog moved. The first row of hemlocks was just visible now, dark shapes at the limit of what the porch light could do, standing the way hemlocks stand, which is still and vertical, and exactly where they are supposed to be. Nothing at the 30-foot mark. Nothing at the edge of the light. I made the tea. I sat at my father's kitchen table, in the chair he always sat in, the one that faced the back window, and I drank it. And I watched the yard until the sky behind the forest began to suggest that morning was happening somewhere on the other side of the mountain. I did not go back to bed. In the morning I walked the yard. I went out through the back door in the early light in the wet grass, and I walked to the 30-foot mark, where the light ended and where the thing had been standing. The grass was flattened in a way that could mean several things. And I was not going to tell you it was footprints, because I could not be certain they were footprints. And I am not going to make this account carry more than it can honestly hold. What I can tell you is that the grass was flat, in an area roughly consistent with the space a large figure would occupy, if it had been standing there for several minutes, and that the flat area extended to the property line, to the precise edge of the Cherokee National Forest boundary where my father's mowed grass met the leaf litter of the forest floor. My father was a methodical man. He kept records of everything. The mileage on every car he ever owned, the rainfall amounts in our backyard going back to 1983, the exact dates of every significant frost in our county for 30 years, written in the same blue pen in the same composition notebook that he replaced every January 1st. He was not a man who wrote things down unless they were true. Which is why, when I found the last composition notebook after he died, and I found the final 14, I sat at his kitchen table for a long time without moving. The entries were dated. They were precise. They were written in the same blue pen, and they described, in my father's careful and unhurried hand, something that had been standing at the edge of his property every night for the last 6 weeks of his life. My father's name was Leonard Marsh, which is a name that, in retrospect, has a quality to it that I might find darkly amusing if I were a different kind of person in a different kind of situation, but which I simply find to be one of the details that does not mean anything, and that the mind reaches for anyway when it is looking for meaning in the wrong places. He was 68 years old when he died, and he had lived on the Neshkoro property since my mother left in 2007. Not because the property was particularly meaningful to him before that point, but because it was paid for, and it was his, and it had 40 acres, and he was a man who needed room around him to think. He farmed a small portion of it, a kitchen garden that grew into something larger over the years, and he leased the back 20 acres to a neighbor who ran cattle in the summer. And the remaining land was the marsh boundary, the wetland edge that ran along the entire eastern side of the property, and that flooded in the spring and went dry in August and filled again in September and froze somewhere between late November and the middle of December, depending on the year. My father noted the freeze date every year: November 23rd, 2009, December 1st, 2010, November 19th, 2017. 14 years of freeze dates in the composition notebooks, along with the rainfall and the mileage and the frost dates and the other careful measurements of a man who found stability in the act of quantifying the world around him. The last notebook has all of that. And then, beginning on October 9th of last year, it has something else. I found the notebook 8 days after he died, when I drove up from Madison to begin closing the house. He had died of a stroke, fast, the way my grandmother had gone, the way the men in that family apparently go, which is without warning and without extended suffering and without the chance to say the things that people say when they know they are going. He had not called me. He had not written me a letter. What he had done, as far as I can determine, is exactly what he always did, which is continue keeping his records until the morning he could not, and leave those records in the kitchen drawer where the composition notebooks always went, and trust that I would find them, and trust that I could handle what was in them. I am not sure he was right about that last part, but I am going to tell you what was in them anyway, because I have been carrying it for 14 months, and the carrying has a weight that requires, eventually, redistribution. The first entry that is different from all the others is dated October 9th, and it reads in my father's hand as follows. Something at the marsh edge tonight, east fence line, did not get a good look. We'll watch tomorrow. That is it. That is the whole entry for October 9th. One sentence of observation, one sentence of intention, exactly the way he recorded everything. October 10th, clearer tonight. Standing at the fence line at the east boundary, near the second post from the cattail stand. Tall, arms at sides, did not move while I watched. Approximately 15 minutes of observation. Could not identify. October 11th. Present again. Same location. I walked to the barn and got the field glasses. In the field glasses, it is the same tall, arms at sides, facing the house. Cannot see the face clearly. Something wrong with the face in the field glasses. Will describe when I have better words for it. October 12th, no entry. October 13th. Returned last night, but did not write it down because I did not know what to write. It moved. Not toward the house, along the fence line southward, approximately 20 feet, and then stopped, stewed for another hour, went back to the marsh before first light. I know it went back to the marsh because I watched it go, and the direction was the marsh, and it did not return. I want to pause here, because I want you to understand what you are reading along with me, which is a 68-year-old man in a farmhouse in central Wisconsin, watching something move along his fence line at night through field glasses and recording it the same way he recorded rainfall amounts, with the same blue pen in the same composition notebook, with the same controlled and methodical attention. He did not call me. He did not call anyone, as far as I can determine. He watched it, and he recorded it, and he kept watching and kept recording for 31 consecutive nights between October 9th and November 9th, which is the date of the last entry, which was 5 days before the stroke that killed him. I am going to tell you the progression, because the progression is the thing. By October 17th, it had moved from the east fence line to the edge of the mowed grass at the back of the yard, which is approximately 60 feet closer to the house than the fence line. By October 23rd, it was at the midpoint of the backyard, 40 feet from the house. By October 30th, it was at the edge of the porch light, at the exact boundary where the light from the back porch lamp ran out and the dark of the yard took over. My father noted the distance each night. He paced it off in the morning, after it was gone, the way he paced off the garden rows when he was planning the planting. He wrote the distances in the notebook with the same precision he brought to everything. 60 feet, 52 feet, 47 feet, 40 feet, 38 feet, 35. Getting closer. Every night, closer. And then on October 31st, the entry reads as follows. Did not come last night. Waited until 2 in the morning. Nothing at the fence line, nothing in the yard, nothing at the porch light edge. Temperature dropped to 18 overnight. Possible the cold has driven it back. Will continue to observe. November 1st. Back. Closer than before the night it did not come. 29 feet from the house. As if the night it missed has to be accounted for somehow. I sat at my father's kitchen table, and I read that sentence 3 times. As if the night it missed has to be accounted for somehow. My father, who measured rainfall and frost dates and freeze days and car mileage, who quantified the world as a way of making it stable, had encountered something that was itself quantifying, something that was keeping its own record of the distance and closing it on a schedule. And he had recognized this, and he had written it down in the only way available to him, which was as precisely as he could with the words he had. As if the night it missed has to be accounted for somehow. I want to tell you what the November entries contain, because they are different from the October entries in a way that I need to be accurate about. In October, my father's entries are observational. Distance, position, duration, behavior. The field glasses, the direction of movement. The return to the marsh before first light. In November, something changes in the writing. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to someone who did not know my father. But I knew my father, and I knew his writing, and I can tell you that beginning around November 4th, the entries have a quality that the October entries do not have, which is the quality of a man who is writing something down because he needs to say it, even though there is no one to say it to. November 4th, 23 feet. The smell comes with it now. I do not know how to describe the smell except to say it is the marsh, but underneath the marsh, the mud layer, the deep cold mud that the frost does not reach, and the smell of things that have been at the bottom of standing water for a long time. The smell enters the house. Windows are closed, doors sealed, the smell enters anyway. I do not sleep well. This is a new development and I am recording it. November 6th, 19 feet. I have been thinking about whether to call Ruth. I have decided not to. She would worry, and there is nothing she could do, and I do not want her to worry. Ruth is my sister. She lives in Green Bay. I called her after I found the notebook, and I read her the November 6th entry over the phone, and she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "He never called me." And I said, "I know, And she said, "He should have called me." And I said, "I know," and we were both quiet for a while. November 7th. 16 feet. It stands in the yard, and I watch it from the kitchen window. Tonight, for the first time, I turned the porch light off. I do not know why. It felt like the right thing. In the dark, I could still see it, which I was not expecting, because it is not bright. It is not luminous, but it has a quality in the dark that makes it visible in the way that a solid thing is visible in the dark when there is enough ambient light to define a shape. The face is wrong. I said I would describe it when I had the words. I do not have the right words. The face is there and the eyes are not there. Not missing. Not dark. Something that is doing the opposite of what eyes do, taking the light rather than giving it back. The face is there, and the eyes are not there. Not missing, not dark. Something that is doing the opposite of what eyes do. My father, who wrote rainfall amounts in millimeters and car mileage to the tenth of a mile, reached for that description, for the thing that is doing the opposite of what eyes do. And it is the most accurate description of the same detail that I have read in anything I have found in 14 months of looking. He had never read anyone else's account. He had no framework for this. He arrived at that description alone, in a farmhouse in central Wisconsin, watching something stand in his yard at night, and he wrote it down because writing things down was what he did. November 8th, 12 feet. I did not sleep at all last night. I sat in the kitchen chair by the window and I watched it. At some point I was aware that I had been watching it for a very long time without moving, and that it had been watching me or facing me, or doing whatever it does that I have been calling watching, and that neither of us had moved for what the clock said was 3 hours. I do not remember 3 hours. I remember sitting down, and I remember the clock saying 4:47 in the morning, and I do not remember the time between. The smell in the house is very strong. I have opened the windows to clear it, and the smell outside is the same as the smell inside, and so the opening of the windows accomplishes nothing. I do not remember 3 hours. I held the notebook, and I looked at that sense, and I thought about the 19 minutes in the Pigeon River Gorge, and the 4 minutes at the Junction gas station, and I understood that my father had lost 3 hours sitting in his kitchen chair, watching something stand in his yard 12 feet from his house, and that he had recorded this with the same blue pen and the same controlled hand, and that the control of the hand was itself a kind of bravery that I do not have a better word for. November 9th, the last entry, 9 feet from the house. At the edge of the porch. I have not turned the porch light on since the 7th. I think it is better without the light. I think the light was for me rather than for seeing it, and I do not think the light does anything that I need done. I am going to go outside tonight. I have been thinking about this for several days. I am going to go outside and stand on the porch, and I am going to see what happens when there is not a window between us. I do not know what will happen. I think nothing bad will happen. I have watched this thing for 31 nights, and it has not done anything that can record as harmful. It has come closer. that is what it has done. I am curious about what it wants, and I have decided the window is not a good enough instrument for finding out. I will write tomorrow. He did not write tomorrow. He died 5 days later, on November 14th, of a stroke that his doctor said had likely been building for some time. A slow accumulation of pressure that resolved itself in the kitchen at some point in the early morning hours, and that was fast, and that he did not survive. The doctor said there was no connection between anything in his recent experience and the stroke. I have thought about whether that is true for 14 months, and I have not resolved it, and I have decided I am not going to resolve it. What I have done instead is go to the property. I went 6 times between January and April. I did not go after dark on the first 3 visits. On the 4th visit, I stayed until 9 in the evening, and on the 5th until 11, and on the 6th I stayed through the night, or I intended to, because I was going to do what my father had done, which is observe and record, because I am his daughter, and I have his composition notebooks, and I bought the same brand of notebook he used, and the same brand of blue pen, and I was going to sit in the kitchen chair, by the window, and I was going to watch the yard, and I was going to write down what I saw. The marsh had refrozen by January. It thawed in March, and was still thawing in April. I did not see anything at the fence line or in the yard on any of the 6 visits. On the 6th visit, on a night in late April when the marsh had fully thawed, and the water was back, and the smell of it was in the air the way it is every spring, specific and alive and green underneath the cold, I sat in the kitchen chair by the window at 11 in the evening, and I looked at the yard. The yard was the yard. The porch light was off, because I had turned it off the way my father had turned it off, because it felt right, because some instructions are in the record, even when they are not stated as instructions. At 12:40 in the morning, something changed in the yard. I am going to tell you what I observed, and I am going to use my father's method, which is precision and restraint, and the acknowledgement of what I do not have adequate words for, rather than the substitution of less adequate words. The smell arrived through closed windows, the way my father described, entering the house without a vector I could identify, was present in the kitchen air. Before I had registered any change in the outdoor smell through the glass, the marsh smell, and underneath it the other thing, the deep cold mud layer, the bottom of standing water. My hands went to the notebook. I wrote, 12:40, smell arrived. The windows were closed, and no draft source was identified. I looked at the yard, at the fence line, at the east boundary, near the second post from the cattail stand, which I knew from the notebook, which I had walked to that afternoon to locate. Something was standing. I wrote 12:42, figure at the fence line, east boundary, second post from cattail stand. I wrote tall, arms at sides facing the house. I wrote cannot see the face. And then I sat and I looked at it, and I thought about my father sitting in this same chair, with this same window, looking at this same fence line for 31 nights, alone, getting up every morning to pace off the distance, writing it down in the same blue pen. Getting up every morning, 31 mornings of pacing off the distance and writing it down, and going to bed every night, knowing it was going to be there when he woke, and that it was going to be closer, and not calling Ruth, and not calling me, and then writing, on November 9th, that he was going to go outside. I sat in the chair. I looked at the fence line. The figure was there, and I looked at it, and it was the size my father had described, and the stillness my father had described, and the face that did the opposite of what faces do with light. I did not go outside. I am going to be honest about why. Not because I was afraid, though I was afraid. Because the notebook ends on November 9th with my father saying he is going to go outside, and 5 days later he was dead. And I do not know what happened on the porch on the night of November 9th, and I do not know if it has anything to do with what happened in the kitchen on November 14th, and I have decided, in the absence of that knowledge, to not go outside. It is a different decision than my father made. I do not know if it is a better one. I sat in the chair until 4 in the morning, and then I wrote, 4:02, figure gone. Return to marsh direction. Smell dissipating. I closed the notebook. I have not gone back to the property after dark since April. The property is still mine. I pay the taxes, and I keep the utilities on at a minimum, and I call the neighbor about the cattle lease, and I do not go up after dark. My father's notebooks are on my shelf in Madison. All 14 of them, the rainfall, and the mileage, and the frost dates, and the freeze days, and the last one, with October 9th through November 9th, at the end of it. I have read the last 31 entries many times. What I keep coming back to is not the distances, though the distances are the architecture of the dread, the slow, measurable closing of the gap between the marsh and the house. What I keep coming back to is November 1st, back. Closer than before the night it did not come. 29 feet, as if the night it missed has to be accounted for somehow. My father understood something in that entry, something about the nature of what was crossing his yard. He understood that it was keeping its own record, that it had a schedule, and the schedule did not accommodate absences, so that a night it did not come was a deficit that the following night would correct for. He understood this, and he recorded it, and he kept watching. He was a methodical man. He kept records of everything. He watched something come out of the Buffalo Lake wetlands every night for 31 nights, and he recorded the distances in the same blue pen, and he did not call anyone. And on November 9th, he decided to go outside and find out what it wanted. And 5 days later, he was gone. I do not know what happened on that porch. I have made a decision not to find out the same way. But I think about it on the nights when the apartment is quiet and the city is doing its 3 in the morning pause, when there is nothing moving on the street below, and the room is the specific still of a room that is waiting for something it will not name. I think about my father in the kitchen chair. I think about the field glasses and the composition notebook and the blue pen and the 31 nights. I think about the sentence he wrote on November 1st, about the night it missed being accounted for. And I think about November 9th, and I think about the porch. And I think about the fact that my father, who was a methodical man, who kept records of everything, who wrote things down because they were true, wrote on November 9th that he did not think anything bad would happen. He had watched it for 31 nights. He knew it better than anyone. He did not think anything bad would happen. And I have been turning that over for 14 months. And I cannot decide if that is reassuring or if it is the most frightening thing in any of those 31 entries. I think it might be both. I think it might be exactly both. My son was 4 years old when he started telling me about the man who visited his room at night. I want to tell you how I handled that, and I want to be honest about it, because the honest version is not the version where I immediately took him seriously, and the honest version is not the version where I dismissed him, either. The honest version is that I did what most parents do, which is hold two things at once: the ordinary developmental explanation and the specific, cold, animal awareness that something in the telling was not ordinary, and I lived in the space between those two things for 6 weeks before the space collapsed. Owen was a serious child. I want to establish that before anything else, because it is the thing that made the difference, the thing that meant the difference, the thing that I kept coming back to in those 6 weeks when I was holding the two explanations at once and trying to decide which one to put down. He was not a child given to invention for its own sake. He did not have imaginary friends. He did not tell stories that began as true and became embellished the way children's stories do. When Owen told me something, he told it the way he did everything, which was carefully and specifically, with a concentration of a child who takes the transfer of information seriously and wants to get it right. He was 4 years old, and he told me carefully and specifically about the man in his room. The first time he mentioned it was a Tuesday morning in March, at breakfast. He said it the way he said most things at breakfast, between bites, without particular emphasis, the way you mention something when you are not yet sure whether it requires emphasis or not. He said there was a man in his room last night. I said, "What do you mean, a man?" He said, "A tall man?" He said the man stood by the window and he did not say anything, and he was looking at Owen. I said, "Were you dreaming?" Owen thought about this for a moment, in the specific way he thought about questions when he wanted to answer accurately. Then he said he did not think so, because he was awake, and he could see his nightlight and his bookshelf, and the tall man was there the same as those things. I said, "Sometimes we see things when we are just waking up that are not really there, and our brains make them feel very real." Owen said, "I know about that." This was different. I moved the conversation forward, the way you move a conversation forward when you are not ready for where it is going, and Owen ate his breakfast and went to preschool, and I spent the morning in the specific, low-grade unease of a parent who has heard something they cannot fully account for and cannot stop accounting for. The second time he mentioned, it was the following Friday. Same matter-of-fact delivery. Same breakfast table. He said the tall man came back. I asked him to tell me more about the tall man. Owen said he was very tall. He said he was taller than the ceiling, which made no spatial sense, and which I noted for that reason. Because children describe things imprecisely, and Owen did not describe things imprecisely. And if Owen said he was taller than the ceiling, there was something specific he was trying to convey and was not finding the right words for. I asked if the tall man said anything. Owen said no. He said the tall man just stood by the window and looked at him. I asked if the tall man frightened him. Owen thought about this longer than he thought about the other questions. Then he said, "Not frightened exactly." He said he did not know the word. He said it felt like when you know someone is watching you, but they do not know that you know, and you do not know what to do, because moving would tell them you know, so you stay still. He said it felt like that. He was 4 years old, and he said it felt like that. I want to pause here, because that description from a 4-year-old at a breakfast table in Clarksville, Tennessee, is the thing that broke the space between the two explanations. Not because it was frightening, though it was frightening. Because it was too precise. Because a 4-year-old who tells you about imaginary visitors gives you dragons and friendly monsters and characters from the shows they watch. A 4-year-old who describes the specific social paralysis of knowing you are observed by something that does not know. You know it is not drawing from the available well of 4-year-old invention. He was describing something real that he had experienced. I went to his room that afternoon while he was at preschool, and I stood in it and I looked at it the way I had not looked at it before, not as his room, but as a space. It was a small room, 10 by 12, with a window on the east wall facing the drainage corridor. The nightlight was on the south wall, near the door. The bookshelf was against the west wall. The bed was under the window, because that was how the furniture fit best, and because Owen had wanted it there. The window. The drainage corridor outside the window was overgrown and poorly lit and ran the full length of the block without any residential lighting aimed at it. It was at night a strip of absolute dark behind the houses. And from Owen's window, at night, that dark was the view. I examined the window. The latch was secure. The screen was intact. There was nothing on the outside of the sill that suggested anything had been near it. I stood in Owen's room in the afternoon light, and I felt nothing, which is either evidence of nothing, or evidence that whatever was there at night was not there in the afternoon, and I have not been able to determine which of those it is. I moved his bed to the opposite wall that afternoon, so the window was behind his head rather than in front of his face when he slept. Owen noticed immediately when he came home from preschool. He did not say anything about it. He looked at the bed in its new position, and then he looked at the window, and then he looked at me. And the look he gave me was not the look of a child who has had his room rearranged without being consulted. It was the look of a child who has understood that the adult has heard something and responded, and who is not sure whether the response is sufficient. I said, "I thought you might like it better this way." Owen said, "Okay." He did not bring up the tall man for 2 weeks, and I allowed myself in those 2 weeks to believe that the moving of the bed had been sufficient, that whatever was happening, and I held open still, the possibility that it was developmental, that it was the particular imaginative flowering that some children go through at this age, that it was my son's version of the imaginary friend, serious as he was, whatever it was, had been addressed by the simple act of repositioning the furniture. I was not right about that. He came to my room on a Thursday night, at what I later determined was approximately 3 in the morning, and he stood at the side of my bed and he said, quietly and without drama, "Mom." I woke immediately, the way parents of young children wake immediately to the sound of their child's voice. The specific alertness that installs itself when you become a parent, and that I understand does not fully uninstall when the children are grown. I said, "What is it?" He said the tall man was back. I sat up. I said, "In your room?" He said, "No," he said, "in the hallway." He said the tall man was in the hallway between his room and mine. I got up. I turned on my bedside lamp, and I went to the bedroom door, and I opened it, and I want to tell what I saw in the hallway, and I am going to be accurate. The hallway was a hallway, 10 feet long, with Owen's door at one end and the bathroom door at the other, and the small linen closet on the south wall, and the overhead fixture which I reached and turned on. Empty hallway, closed doors, the smell of the house at night, carpet, and the particular quality of interior air that has been breathed and recirculated, and has the temperature of a house that has been heated all winter. And underneath that, so faint I almost placed it as nothing, was something else. Something cold in the smell rather than in the air. Cold as a structural quality rather than a temperature. Present for the 2 or 3 breaths I was standing in the doorway before it was gone. It was gone. The hallway was a hallway. I took Owen back to his bed and I sat with him until he was asleep, and then I went back to my room, and I lay in the dark for a long time. I called my mother the next morning, not because I was going to tell her about the tall man, but because I needed to hear her voice, and in the conversation, without planning to, I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How old is Owen now?" I said, 4. She said, "Your Uncle Danny saw something in his room when he was 4. I said, "What?" She said it the way she said things she had been holding for a long time carefully, with the particular care of someone who has carried a piece of information for decades, and is uncertain still about the weight of releasing it. She said that when my Uncle Danny was 4 years old, living in the house in Hopkinsville, he had told her parents, who were my grandparents, about a tall man who stood in his room at night. She said my grandparents had handled it the way parents handle those things, and that Danny had stopped mentioning it after a few weeks, and that, as far as she knew, nothing had come of it. I said, "Did Danny ever talk about it as an adult?" She said that to nod her. I said, "Is Danny okay?" She said, "Yes, of course Danny is fine. Danny has been fine for 40 years. It was something that happened when he was 4, and it stopped, and he was fine." She said this with the specific emphasis of someone reassuring themselves as much as the person they are talking to. I said, "Mom, did anything else happen in that house?" She was quiet for longer this time. Then she said, "Your grandmother said once that the house was visited." I said, "What does that mean?" She said she did not know exactly, that my grandmother had said it once and not said it again, that it was in the context of a conversation about Danny and the tall man, and that my grandmother had said, "Some houses are visited," and then changed the subject. And my mother had been 11 years old and had understood that the subject was closed. Some houses are visited. I sat with that for a very long time. I want to tell you what I did with the information, because it is the center of what I am still living with 2 years later. I did not move. I did not break the lease. I did not call anyone, not a priest, not a professional of any kind. I moved Owen's nightlight to the east wall near the window, because I had read somewhere that children feel safer when the light is between them and the thing they are afraid of. And because it was something I could do, and I started sitting outside Owen's door. Not every night, most nights. After he was asleep, I would sit in the hallway with my back against the wall outside his door, in the dark, and I would wait. I did this for 3 weeks. I do not know exactly what I thought I was going to do if something happened, but the sitting felt like the right thing, the available thing, the version of protection I was able to offer. On the 4th night of the 3rd week, sitting in the hallway at approximately 2:40 in the morning, I felt the corridor change. The temperature dropped, directional and specific, coming from the east end of the hallway where Owen's room was. The smell changed, and the smell it changed to was the thing I had caught for 2 or 3 breaths the night Owen came to my room. The cold, structural smell that belonged to nothing in the house. And the quality of the hallway changed, in the way that a hallway changes when it is occupied rather than empty. The subtle shift that a body brings to a space, simply by being in it. Something was in Owen's room. I stood up. I stood at Owen's door with my hand on the knob for a long time, longer than I want to admit. The cold was present, and the smell was present, and inside the room my son was asleep, and whatever was in there with him was in there with him regardless of whether I opened the door. I opened the door. The room was the room. The nightlight on the east wall, the bookshelf, the bed with Owen in it, on his back, his arms at his sides, his face arranged in the sleep of a child who is deeply and completely at rest. The window. In the window. And I am going to tell you this as accurately as I can, because accuracy is the only thing I have. In the window, which faced the drainage corridor, which faced the absolute dark behind the houses, there was a shape. Outside the glass. Tall. The kind of tall that, the glass made ambiguous, that I could not fully resolve into measurement, but tall enough that Owen's description of taller than the ceiling, which I had logged as a child's imprecision, became, in that moment, the most accurate description available. It was outside the window, which was on the first floor of a ranch house, which meant it was standing in the drainage corridor, which meant it was standing in the narrow, overgrown, completely unlighted strip of land behind the houses. in the absolute dark, against the outside of my son's window. Its arms were at its sides. I could not see its face. I want to be precise about why. It was not the dark entirely. I could see the shape of it clearly enough. What I could not see was the face in the way you cannot see a face when the face is absorbing, rather than reflecting the available light. When the place where the face should be has a quality of density rather than feature. It was outside the glass, it was still, and Owen was asleep in his bed with his arms at his sides and his face at peace, in the specific, uncomplicated peace of a child who is held safely in sleep. And whatever was outside the window was outside it and not inside it, and had been outside it, as far as I understood, on every occasion when Owen had reported the tall man, the window being the constant in every account.
Outside.
Always outside.
At the glass.
I stood in the doorway of my son's room, and I looked at it, and it did not move, and it did not look at me. And after a time, I cannot say how long, the cold in the room thinned, and the smell thinned, and the shape outside the window was not there. I went to Owen's bed, and I put my hand on his back and felt him breathing, and I stood there until I was steady, and then I went back to the hallway, and I sat down with my back against the wall, and I did not go back to sleep. In the morning, Owen ate his breakfast, and he did not mention the tall man, and he did not mention it the following morning or the morning after that, and in the weeks that followed, he did not mention it at all. We moved in June. The lease was up, and I had been thinking about a different school district, and those reasons were real and are still real, and they were also, if I am being entirely honest, not the only reasons. Owen has not mentioned the tall man since we left the Clarksville house. He is 6 now. He is in the 1st grade. He is still the serious child he has always been, specific and careful and interested in getting things right. And he does not talk about that winter. And I have not asked him about it, because I do not know what asking would open, and I have decided to let it stay closed until he opens it himself, if he ever does. I called my mother after we moved, and I told her we had left the Clarksville house, and I told her why, as much as I could tell it. And there was a silence on the phone. Then she said, "I called Danny." I said, "What did you tell him?" She said she told him what Owen had experienced, and that I was going to tell the story, and that she wanted him to know. I said, "What did Danny say?" She said Danny was quiet for a long time, and then he said he remembered the tall man, and that he had not thought about it in years, in decades, and that hearing about it brought something back that he did not have words for. She said he asked one question. I said, "What question?" She said, "Danny asked whether the tall man was outside the window or inside the room." I said, "Outside. Always outside. At the glass." My mother was quiet. Then she said, "Danny said in his room it was outside too." I have been thinking about that for 2 years, about what it means that it stays outside, about what it means that it came to my uncle when he was 4, and to my son when he was 4, and that in both cases it stood outside the glass and did not come in, about whether the outside is a boundary it has chosen or a boundary it is held to, and what the difference between those two things would mean. About my grandmother, who lived in that Hopkinsville house for 20 years after Danny was 4, who said some houses are visited and then changed the subject, and who kept whatever she knew in the same place she kept everything she decided the people she loved did not need to carry. The women in my family, it seems, are very good at carrying things alone. I have Owen's drawing on my wall. He drew it in April, 2 months after the Tuesday in March when he first mentioned the tall man, and I found it in his preschool folder when I was going through the week's papers, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I held it for a long time, and before I put it in the folder and put the folder in the drawer, where I keep the things I am not ready to deal with directly. It is a crayon drawing, the way 4-year-olds draw, the figures large and simple and without much detail. A rectangle for a window, and a smaller rectangle inside it for the glass, and outside the glass, a vertical shape in black crayon, tall, filling the space from the bottom of the paper to the top. No face. He had left the face blank, and at the bottom, in the careful, deliberate printing he was working on at preschool, was one word he had written with the concentration of a child who takes the transfer of information seriously and wants to get it right. One word. Watching. I still have the drawing. I have not framed it. But I have not thrown it away either. And on the nights when the apartment is quiet and my son is asleep, and the window in his room faces an ordinary lit street with ordinary lit houses across from it, I sometimes take the drawing out of the drawer and I hold it and I think about what he saw and what my uncle saw and what my grandmother knew and kept and what the women in my family have been carrying alone for longer than I have been alive. And I think about the word he chose, watching. Not frightening, not bad, not a monster. Watching. He was 4 years old, and that is the word he chose, and I have been trying to decide for 2 years whether that is the most frightening word in this story or the most consoling one, and I have not been able to decide, and I am beginning to think that is the point. Some things are built to live in the space where you cannot decide. This is one of them.